What about COVID? Yeah, that's a whole different matter, right? Major effect on everything in our industry.
Welcome to the Willis Towers Watson podcast, Vital Signs, Risk and Insurance for Healthcare, where we discuss the risk management and insurance trends and issues facing the U.S. healthcare industry. We'll speak with our industry experts and clients in search of ways to improve your risk and insurance vital signs.
Welcome, everyone, to Willis Towers Watson's podcast, Vital Signs, Risk and Insurance for Healthcare. Today's podcast represents episode 2 of our first podcast series. In this series, we are looking at healthcare professional liability coverage issues in a hard market. And today we're going to be discussing environmental liability. My name is Mary Ann McGivney, and I head up Willis Towers Watson's healthcare industry practice. I'd like to welcome Robin Kelliher. Welcome, Robin.
Hi, Mary Ann.
And I have Brian McBride. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Mary Ann, glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. Robin and Brian are both from Willis Towers Watson's environmental industry practice. Thank you both for joining me this morning. Let's talk specifically about the healthcare industry for a moment. I find environmental liability for healthcare to be a little difficult to sort out. There's some obvious risks in healthcare, but healthcare professional liability forms, or HPL forms, do have a pollution exclusion. So where to find coverage sometimes is hard to determine. Maybe we can start at the very beginning and talk a little bit about how this coverage has evolved over the years. So Brian, as the industry practice leader for Willis's environmental practice, where did environmental coverage originate and how was it first used to address healthcare exposures?
Well, environmental coverages actually were developed in the early 80s and by a handful of carriers, and mainly as a result of some of the groundbreaking legislation that was going on at the time that was there to protect our natural resources. So like Superfund liability, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. When that legislation broke, a lot of general liability policies excluded environmental liability from their coverages. But today there are over like 40 carriers offering environmental coverage on a global basis. And some of the coverages that were originally site-related coverages that benefited healthcare, some of those coverages included like coverage for tanks, so backup generators, potentially financial assurance if they needed it, infectious or medical waste as part of the definition of pollution condition. Any waste flow issues that a hospital might have, such as chemicals or mercury or other items. Incinerators, in many cases, some hospitals, formerly had incinerators on site, which created all kinds of pre-existing issues that needed to be addressed, and other things like business interruption and extra expense, depending on the presence of contamination on a hospital property.
Yeah, and I do remember both the Superfund and the medical waste stories of things showing up, washing up on beaches, and the need to clean up Superfund sites. Those were all real big in the news for quite a while.
Love Canal and Silent Spring was a book that was very popular at the time. All of that legislation was coming out. So
yeah. So Robin, are there other environmental coverages associated with healthcare exposures that we haven't talked about yet?
Absolutely. Construction projects cause a wide range of environmental risks. So a lot of our healthcare clients have older buildings. So renovation of older buildings, we deal with lead-based paint, asbestos-containing materials in the ceiling tiles or roofing. We have PCBs and caulk. So renovations, when our clients are doing renovations, it can easily spread contaminated dust throughout the facility. And also during construction expansion, excavation, for parking garages or just expansion of a pad can lead to the discovery of unknown contamination. So we often see the need for possibly a contractor's pollution liability policy to address the risks that are caused during the construction project itself.
For our healthcare clients with patients that are potentially immunocompromised, I can see where construction and renovation can be really risky to patient care.
Yeah, the importance of controlling that dust and making sure you have proper containment doing work in healthcare facilities is critically important. Yes.
And Robin, we have seen, some significant bodily injury and even fatality claims around construction projects for that very issue. So, unfortunately.
Wow. So have these environmental coverages further evolved for the healthcare sector since their introduction to the market? I mean, Brian, I think you said the 1980s were the first forms, and a lot has happened since then. So what's new today?
Well, beyond the exposures associated with the operations of the sites, facilities, and things in the ground, and things that are going on within the facilities, indoor air quality became more of an issue like around 2003. Mold became an issue. Again, general liability policies first began excluding mold, and then 2005 Legionella became more of an issue. A lot of Legionella cases in the news. Again, general liability excluded. Environmental was there to step in. And initially, when those first broke, environmental did exclude mold and Legionella, just like their GL brothers and sisters. But very quickly they figured out a way to become more comfortable with writing these exposures, by having mold plans, Legionella plans, indoor air quality plans, how they would deal with things. And that led them to believe that they could underwrite these more successfully than general liability.
Then similar, I'm going to continue on that point, as the pollution related risks were becoming, more and more excluded under general liability, but also property policy forms, as the carriers got more comfortable with them, our environmental carriers, they actually started introducing branded healthcare forms that really targeted hospitals and healthcare facilities. They brought in coverage by having policy forms that literally said healthcare. They also added affirmative coverage for bacteria and virus, where the policy form was silent, and maybe there was an argument for coverage because, again, it was a branded form targeting hospitals. Bacteria and virus actually became affirmatively listed within our policy definitions. And the way the carriers got comfortable with providing this coverage is, by introducing the concept of facility-borne illness versus communicable disease. So the carriers would add coverage for what they deem to be facility-borne, but then limit coverage by putting a communicable disease exclusion or some sort of limitation on there. So it was a way to get some coverage in a way the carriers felt comfortable providing it.
And I understand that the different court interpretations of the definition of pollutant can impact how coverage may apply, so that, something may be a pollutant in one state and may not be in another.
That's true. That's true. And we'll be talking about that in about 2 or 3 minutes with respect to what we're seeing with COVID. But the fact that the carriers are affirmatively or have been affirmatively adding bacteria and virus to the policies really kind of speaks to the fact that, silence, created ambiguity maybe in the CGL forms, which resulted in, or HPL forms, which resulted in specific exclusions. The pollution carriers picked it up by specifically listing them, and, we're kind of where we are pre-COVID.
Well, you mentioned the COVID word, so I'm going to move us along to today's exposures. But this has been great background regarding the development of exposures and how those pollution policies have evolved. But let's talk a little bit about pandemics, because those have been some of the more recent concerns. So, Brian, do you want to provide some thoughts on pandemics?
Sure. I mean, and to really get a good look and have a good discussion on where we are with COVID, you really have to kind of back up a little bit further than that to some of the other pandemics that we've had, like SARS, swine flu, H1N1, and Ebola, which was around 2014, I believe. And in the U.S., that really had minimal effects. So we really didn't have the exposure to the forms like we have with COVID.
And what about COVID, Brian?
What about COVID? Yeah, that's a whole different matter, right? Major effect on everything in our industry. From a claim standpoint, which Robin's about to address, but from the underwriting and broking side of renewal terms and conditions, major effect on every renewal that we've looked at. Anything that had affirmative coverage before has pretty much evaporated since March, April, May, and all of the renewals now it's affecting. Any midterm modifications to any coverages, if there wasn't, if you had affirmative cover, that's going to be gone, and they're going to be looking to actually affirmatively limit the coverage going forward to any midterm modifications. Any coverage extensions could be affected. So projects that were like mothballed during the COVID quarantine, as we need to add more term onto the end to complete these coverages, to complete these projects, it's going to be more difficult to do so. And also the addition of any new properties to a site pollution coverage, those properties are going to have less coverage than the ones originally written prior to COVID.
Robin, what other things should we be considering as we talk about COVID?
As Brian alluded to, or didn't really allude to, has said it, we're seeing a lot of claims. So the sheer number of claims for COVID that were reported under our pollution policy to date equal the number of claims that were reported under our property policies. So, we're seeing significant number of COVID claims, and we're seeing the carriers take different positions as respects to how their policies respond. Some of those positions are a little disappointing, but we're early on in the process. We've seen some coverage litigation, so I think we're going to be looking to see how the courts have been interpreting, how these pollution policies will respond. It's been again a little bit surprising, a little bit disappointing, but one thing I can say, the carriers are being consistent and they're being very thoughtful in the way that they respond. A response to a COVID claim is the same response for one insured. You're going to see the same response for every insured, because the carriers really need to, from their perspective, be very consistent in how they're handling these matters. But as a result of that, the COVID claims, we're also seeing some pullback on some of the other coverages that we were taking for granted over the last 10, 15 years. So, while there's still coverage for bacteria, non-bacteria, non-virus exposures, the carriers are providing that coverage, but they're underwriting it more, and maybe even pulling back on some of the coverage for mold and Legionella.
And I've seen some bleed over into the healthcare professional liability and commercial general liability forms as well, particularly with the mold exclusions, which are in some cases are being expanded to include things like viruses, communicable disease, pathogens. So meaning there's probably even less coverage available in those forms when it comes to COVID via the mold exclusion. So it seems to me that coordination between all of these coverages is becoming even more important, particularly as our exposures have been evolving over the years, to make sure that we know what is and isn't covered in each form.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think you really hit it right on the head there, Marianne. I mean, and what that needs to happen, the way we affect that really is for us as brokers, that are in given specialties like environmental and healthcare, to be talking to each other even more, find out what's going on in our part of the insurance world versus what you've got going on over there, and hopefully that will allow us to be in a situation where we can know exactly where HPL leaves off and environmental begins.
Good. Yeah, really great points. So one final question, because I think it's always easier to understand coverage through claims examples. Do you have some claim stories, some horror stories that you can share with us?
We've had many claims regarding Legionella associated with the nice fountains that greet everyone as they enter the front door of most healthcare facilities, unfortunately.
I wish I had a zombie apocalypse one, but I don't. But now I do have one relating to construction. Again, as I said, when our clients are doing mass excavations to do expansions, in certain geographic areas, they have a fungus in the soil. So unfortunately, we had one claim where there was a fungus release during the excavation that got into the hospital and caused all sort of havoc with respect to the testing results and diagnostic issues. So, that was a big one. That was a significant one, but no zombie ones yet, but I'll let you know.
You could call that one the fungus among us claim. How about that?
Well, if we had a zombie claim, we'd probably have a zombie exclusion too. So we don't have that yet.
It would start in the GL first, and then the environmental would figure out a way to cover it, though.
That's right. Well, I'd like to thank you both for joining me today. It's helpful to have a pair of experts in-house to work through these discussions and figure out how these coverages coordinate. So thanks for joining me, Robin.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne.
And thank you, Brian. We're glad to have you too.
Always a pleasure.
I'd also like to thank our audience and those that tuned in to join our discussion. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second podcast of a 5-part series addressing HPL coverages and some of the more important exclusions. So we hope you will join us again next time. Thanks again for joining our podcast, Vital Signs, Risk and Insurance for Healthcare.
Thank you for joining us for this Willis Towers Watson podcast featuring the latest thinking on the intersection of people, capital, and risk. For more information, visit the Insights section of willistowerswatson.com.